Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus in 5 edition for the White Company non-aligned army. In this video, we'll be talking about who White Company are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through many of the profiles that showcase that identity. Now, it hasn't actually been terribly long since the last time I did a White Company faction focus. They were one of the last faction focuses that I did for N4. Only about 6 months ago now in October 2024. But I knew that I wanted them to be one of the earlier N5 faction focuses that I did, because although in general I won't spend all of N5 talking about how an army was in N4, White Company are a really interesting case study in how changes to the balance and design philosophy of the game can really significantly impact a sectoral. And so, while I don't think White Company were a faction that the developers set out to make really good in N5, just underlying changes to how they chose to balance the game in general have benefited White Company really significantly, which positions them as a really good N5 army, well-rounded with a lot of very solid capabilities. And so we're going to talk about that. But we're going to start by talking about how they were in N4 and why they are an interesting example of addition change affecting how a faction performs. If you go back to my previous video on White Company, you'll hear me talk about, in summary, they're kind of a single wound faction. They've got a lot of things in N4 going on that are really good, lots of different capabilities, some really good gunfighting, some interesting link options, etc. But a lot of the strongest elements that you would gravitate towards in White Company were armor 1 or 2 single wound pieces, blade ops, Karhu, etc. And this didn't make for a bad faction, but it was a limitation that was baked into White Company's DNA in N4. You'd have a lot of pieces where a crit with a combi rifle would put you on your ass, and that meant that there were just decisions that you had to make about risk when you were playing White Company in N4 that were perhaps a little bit more difficult than they might be for other factions. That was fine, they were a very good company, but they had that limitation. And then N5 came along. And there are a couple of things that changed about the edition that White Company has stood to be a significant beneficiary of. The first is that there was a decision as part of how the game was going to go into N5 that the number of sectorals would be reduced. Many of them were just removed from the game, but almost all of them saw refugee profiles flow to other factions and sectorals. And White Company was a major beneficiary of that. Starco was removed from the game. Foreign Company was removed from the game, and both of those were character-heavy armies, and those characters were sold as boxes still. They were still pieces that people owned that didn't necessarily apply easily to, they couldn't translate easily into just any other army. And so all of those characters folded into White Company. And so not only did this significantly expand the size of the White Company's roster at a stroke, but it also positioned White Company to really significantly benefit from another balance philosophy change that was introduced in N5, which is that Corvus Belli in N5 seems to have been much more willing to push the design of character profiles. There is always a risk if you overtune a profile that players will then spam that profile and you'll have an unbalanced army or faction. That's why availability exists as a tool for balance. But the thing about characters is that they're always inherently limited to availability 1. You can only have 1 of any given character. And that means that it's kind of safe for Corvus Belli to push the design of a character a little bit, make them maybe a little bit stronger than you might necessarily otherwise have a miniature that could be taken in multiples, because the worst case scenario is, well, that character is popular, but there's only ever going to be 1 of them in any given army. They're safe to over-design. That means that there are a lot more interesting and strong characters in N5. It isn't a universal thing. There are still a few characters that are a little bit dog water. But in general, if you look around N5, you'll see that most characters are pretty cool and interesting. And White Company, going into N5, has probably the most characters of any army in the game. So just by playing the odds, just by the fact that many characters are stronger, White Company has received both an influx of characters, and then those characters have been buffed. Couple that with N5 seeing another pass across heavy infantry, where the balance of heavy infantry and tags, but particularly heavy infantry in N5, relative to cheaper single wound, small warband style elements, has been adjusted again to get it closer to perhaps models being worth their points across the point spectrum, rather than, as Infinity has traditionally been, the cheapest models kind of being the best and limited only in N4 by troop count. And you have a picture emerging of a sectoral that I don't think Corvus Belli set out intentionally to buff, right? I don't think the design team went, let's really push White Company out. But because of all of the other changes, Fortune has rained her gravy, and White Company are the ones standing there holding a big bowl. And so this means that we have, moving into N5, a faction that has shed their previous identity of being the good single wound faction and emerged actually as a good faction, a good, well-rounded, lots of capabilities kind of faction off the back of these changes that they've seen in N5. Because there are so many characters, and the characters are all basically pretty good, and the characters all do different things, you have a faction that looks at the fact that, well, yes, characters are only availability 1, but I can just put 5 characters in a list and they're all super cool. So I have 5 super cool pieces, and then we'll put some other stuff in that's basically solid, maybe some orc troops, maybe a tag, maybe some remotes, etc. And you have a faction that builds itself out from this core of like cool character identities into an army of usually 15 troops fairly comfortably, that is both robust in a way that N4 White Company wasn't, but still has lots of really solid capabilities and even a few apex pieces, like borderline best-in-class pieces that the faction just sort of like, it had in some respects before, but really has in spades now. And this means that when we're talking about how factions are positioned in N5, you could do far worse. If you were looking to go to almost any event and you wanted a faction that could probably take you there, that gave you a good suite of capabilities, you could do far worse than White Company. So, to talk specifically about their strengths, well, they have all of these characters, and because they have so many characters, they tend not to run out of those availability ones. They can just take more interesting characters, which gives them a developed and complete set of skills and power, etc. That's just a good baseline. On top of that, they have good, not Apex, but very good and available and accessible hacking and network projection. If you wanted to play the hacking game with White Company, you absolutely can, and just as in N4, that's a really nice thing in N5. Just like in N4, White Company has really solid active turn gunfighting. But even with the changes in N5, they do kind of have to choose in their gunfighting between mods and durability. You do still have to make the choice, like Karhu are excellent gunfighters, but they are single wound. You now have the choice between Karhu and orcs and a tag, for example. That choice exists in White Company, but you don't get Karhu level gunfighting necessarily on a piece that also has multiple wounds. But you do have a lot of choices, and any given White Company list should not want for really solid gunfighting. They've got actually truly outstanding close assault, some of the best in the game. And this is really off the back of those characters. There are 3 or 4 characters in White Company, all of which are either good or great value for their cost, all of which are exceptional close assault elements, and frankly, all of which you could put in a list if you wanted to. Over the course of the army showcase, we're going to be talking about all of Valkyrie and Shona Carano and Liang Kai and Carmen, and every one of those is a best-in-class close assault piece, and so that means that White Company, in addition to having many of those pieces be linkable, just carries with it a real door-kicking ability that actually not many other factions necessarily have in that same capacity. Finally, White Company have very nice and flexible link team structures with some really good wildcard access and good baseline links, like you will not be hurting for interesting things to do with your link teams, and you have good but expensive midfield. And this is kind of the same as it was in N4, where you can build a midfield with White Company, but the cost begins to add up quickly. And that kind of segues us into the weaknesses that White Company have, even in N5. And the main one is that you still have to pay for all of this stuff. Those 4 really powerful close assault characters that I mentioned, every one of them is more expensive than, for example, a Datarazi. And so, while it is still very easy and you should generally play White Company to 15 troopers, you do just have to be aware of the mounting cost of all of these showcase pieces that you can put into a list. In addition, as deep as the roster is, there are still trap pieces in White Company. Not all of it is really worthwhile. This is a faction that has the Anaconda tag, and Long Arms, and Cube Jaegers, and this is the only time I'm going to mention any of those pieces because just like in N4, they're all hot trash. Now, This means you don't have to take those pieces, right? You can just completely ignore them and the roster is still very complete, but it is something to be aware of if you're coming into White Company in N5, that there are some trap cards that you might stumble over in the roster if you just try and play everything. Next, while in N4, White Company tended to be a little bit locked into the single wound dudes faction archetype, you can accidentally fall back to this in N5. You shouldn't, you should build some resilience and some failure tolerance into your list, but if you go through a real ooh shiny moment and pick lots and lots of pieces that have just that one single wound with no ability to recur those pieces, etc., no force reconstitution, you can find yourself falling back into the weaknesses of White Company in N4, although of course you'll be retaining their strengths as well, because there are plenty of good pieces you might choose from in that archetype. And this is just a small thing, but it is worth noting, there's very limited ability to play with armed turrets in White Company. They've got one profile that can take it, that profile is fine, but it isn't always something, it's just an engineer, but it isn't always something that you would find yourself reaching for in a list. And so, while there are a bunch of other factions in N5 that can do some like really oppressive things with turrets, White Company aren't one of those. And so if one of those new toys of N5, if the armed turret is a thing that you want to play with in this edition before hopefully they mildly nerf them, you're not going to really be able to do that with White Company. You can take a total reaction bot, you can take an engineer, you can take a baggage bot to reload the engineer, who'll repair the total reaction bot and throw out turrets. You can do that little 3-piece module, but it begins to eat into your points and your piece slots, and there are lots and lots of things competing for air in White Company that make that module not necessarily what you want. Overall, though, White Company in N5 are possibly one of the best positioned factions in the game at the moment. Extremely well-rounded, missing almost no capabilities that you might need to do a winning run at an event, and able to effectively tackle basically every mission in the game in some way or another. Excellent faction. Let's jump into Infinity Army and start going through some profiles. Now, as always, we're going to try and provide some structure as we go through profiles in White Company. And in this case, because so much of White Company is built around some really interesting and solid link teams, we're going to kind of walk through those link teams one by one and segue into some of the most relevant wildcards as we do so. But an important thing to consider as we go through all of these is that there is a lot of wildcard flexibility in White Company that gives you a lot of different options in terms of how you construct and set your army up, but makes White Company highly variable. Now, Fusiliers are the first thing we're going to talk about, and they have a very, very strong place in this faction, although you won't take too many of these profiles. Fusiliers can be the basis of, you need one Fusilier to form, one of either a Haris or a Core, which White Company can take one of each. And this means that if you want to build a White Company list that is running 2 Fusilier fire teams, that's very possible, although in many cases those fire teams will have maybe just one Fusilier, where they act as a cheap order and a gun and link glue, and that's a really good role for line infantry to be playing in N5. However, as much as you can take one Fusilier and then bolt some wildcards to it to get a good Haris team, hopefully getting duo bonuses from the wildcards that you add on, it's also worth thinking about Fusiliers as actually a larger fire team in N5, because there is one specific kind of like defensive fire team in particular, when we get to the first of the wildcards we talk about, that make Fusiliers actually one of the very, very few fire teams in N5 that I am willing to recommend playing all the way up to 5 troops worth of purity, 5 Fusiliers or counts as Fusiliers in a link. Now, that's because of John Hawkwood, who we'll be talking about immediately after this, but Fusiliers are the base there. And if you're going to be doing that, you still don't want to be taking any Fusilier like SWC pieces. That's the kind of link where you take a Fusilier Lieutenant, a Fusilier Decoy with Combi Rifle, a Fusilier Hacker, and a Fusilier Forward Observer. Probably not a Paramedic, because the Paramedic does not synergize particularly with Hawkwood, who will be the main other piece that you add to this link. But the Forward Observer and the Hacker actually both have some merit that are worth talking about. The Hacker is not a good hacker. Let's be completely clear about that. But if you have 5 Fusiliers in the team, it is a hacker that has Sixth Sense. And although Sixth Sense does not render you immune to surprise attack anymore, it does still have the 2 previous effects that it had. 1, you can shoot back through smoke with no penalty, and 2, you ignore stealth. And having one hacker that ignores stealth is kind of the same as actually having all of your hackers ignore stealth. because it means that that one hacker gets an ARO when a stealth model walks through your network. And if that one hacker gets an ARO, your opponent has to either ignore it and give you a unopposed roll, or they have to reset. And resetting breaks stealth, which gives all of your other hackers an ARO. And so just one Fusilier hacker, not particularly strong, no BTS, willpower 12, always being able to ARO against stealth models has a powerful force multiplication effect on all of the other hackers in your army, which are guaranteed to be considerably higher quality than the Fusilier, but the Fusilier is helping. He's doing his best. The other thing is the Forward Observer. It's another specialist, it's only willpower 12, it has specialist bonuses in basically no missions, but it does carry a deployable repeater. And White Company is a faction that has access to multiple pieces that can generate white noise. And as we're going to see as we continue talking through Fusiliers and then into John Hawkwood, is that the ability to smoke shoot, and that includes shooting models with marksmanship and MSV through white noise with a model that doesn't have marksmanship or an MSV, is a really powerful tool in N5. And so being able to, without having to spend points on a repeater or having to awkwardly position one of your link team members, being able to just drop that repeater down and then white noise over the link team that includes John Hawkwood is a really solid ability to have. And if you are taking 5 Fusiliers anyway, having one of them be the Forward Observer, one be a hacker, and then just 2 be generic dudes is a fairly cheap overall loadout that adds 4 orders to your list and ably force multiplies John Hawkwood. And speaking of, our first wild card, John fucking Hawkwood. There is really only one profile that I strongly recommend here, and that is just the non-lieutenant K1 sniper rifle. You can experiment with the others, but don't take the chain of command one, and if you're going to take either lieutenant ones, be aware of the fact that you are running a risk. There are some NCOs in this faction, but John Hawkwood is the kind of piece that you want to be making significant and active and reactive use of, and you don't usually want your lieutenant to be a hard ARO piece. And what an ARO piece John Hawkwood is. The main reason why is that first special skill that he has there, Ballistic Skill Attack +1 special die. Now, Ballistic Skill Attack +1 burst is a wonderful skill to have, but burst bonuses like that don't apply in the reactive turn. Special dice, however, do, which means that Hawkwood in his reactive turn, if he's in a big link team, is firing, or even just a small link team, because he counts as a Fusilier. So even just one other Fusilier and John is enough to get Ballistic Skill Attack Burst 1 with 2 special die, firing a K1 sniper rifle. Now, the K1 sniper rifle is generally not going to do a tremendous amount of damage. It is a single shot weapon. It can only really inflict 1 wound unless it crits. But there is nothing really that shrugs off a K1 hit. There are a few immunity arm pieces, but tags don't want to take K1 hits. Most heavy infantry don't want to take K1 hits, and light infantry still don't want to take damage 7 hits. So what that means is that the K1 sniper rifle has a kind of very wide range of applicability, and Hawkwood is just really good at winning face-to-face rolls in reactive, and that's genuinely rare. If he's in even a link with 3 other Fusiliers, he's going to be Ballistic Skill 14, he's going to be firing 3 dice in ARO, and he's going to have Mimetism -3, and he's going to have unparalleled range bands. On top of that, he's got no wound incapacitation and shock immunity, with a very respectable Armor 3 BTS 6, which makes it very difficult to put him all the way down to dead in one go. He's pretty durable, and he's got courage, so if you want him to hold his ground, he's going to. He's basically the platonic ideal, even with just one Fusilier linked to him. He's just about the platonic ideal of an dedicated ARO piece, and it doesn't really suffer at all for have him transition into an active turn piece, where he's firing 2 dice plus 2 special die. Again, the K1 weapon is going to limit how much damage he can do, but if you just need to put one piece down, even if it's a tag, even if it's a total reaction bot, whatever, it may take him a little bit of time to punch through enemy wounds, but he can do it. He's very good at winning face-to-face rolls. And it's John and the Fusilier link that can and should form the basis of really quite a lot of different White Company lists, but you can configure that Fusilier link in different ways. As I mentioned, you can have just one Fusilier and John and then one other piece, and that's a little 3-person Haris or core. You could have something like Laxmee, who we'll talk about later, any of the wildcards. As long as John and the Fusilier, any Fusilier, are in that link, you'll have the +1 special die, which means that for a very limited footprint in your list, you get just about everything that I just mentioned. Hawkwood will only be ballistic skill 13 rather than 14, but that's still really solid. You can also scale that up to add a couple more Fusiliers in, sometimes say a Lieutenant Fusilier and a decoy, but with the intention of leaving those behind if you want to move the smaller footprint, right? Maybe something like Hawkwood, a Fusilier, and a Haidao, for example. Haidao has some good close assault, Haidao killer hacker. You could move those pieces into the midfield and just leave the other two Fusiliers behind. Finally, you can do the team that I mentioned before, which is the full 4 Fusiliers and Hawkwood. This is kind of dedicated to deployment zone support firepower kind of role, but it's really good and difficult to overcome support firepower because it tips all the way up into that link team having 6th sense. And that's important because we are seeing emerge in N5, or at least I am, and I think other people will see this over time as well. Smoke shooting's really good again. There are a lot of pieces in the game that if you have one of those like intruder style or epsilon style pieces where you have mimetism and an MSV2 or even just an MSV2 and a decent gun with decent burst and some smoke, those pieces are very efficient in a way that they weren't really. Like N4 saw those pieces kind of go away a little bit, so did N3, frankly. But with 6th sense being gated behind a pure 5-person link, very few models have that anymore. And so that's seeing me, for example, be like, yeah, fuck that John Hawkwood guy, I'm going to shoot him down, I'm going to fire at him through smoke, I'm going to stack mimetism and smoke, and I'm going to have my own MSV, and I'm going to give him -9 to hit, so he's hitting on 5, I'm hitting on 13, so I'm going to HMG that guy down, except that then you just take that 5th member of the link, you take 4 Fusiliers and Hawkwood, and he ignores, well, he doesn't ignore the mimetism, but he ignores all the penalties from smoke. And so if you want to have a closed loop, like, no, it's really difficult to stop this guy, that's one of the ways that you can do it. You can absolutely consider both the smaller footprint Fusilier teams and a big static core that Hawkwood is at the head of as both an active turn and reactive turn piece. Now, at 36 points and 1.5 SWC, I don't think he's overpowered, but I do think he is one of the best in class at what he does and has a couple of different roles, and that is just super rare. And it's only really in White Company that you can get him all the way up to having that 6th sense in addition to everything else that gives him many different roles that makes him, as it should be, he's the guy that leads the company, one of the defining features of White Company. Now, the next fire team to talk about, and we'll talk through some wildcards as well, is the Orc Troops fire team. Now, this is kind of a dedicated Haris team. I don't think you would too often run this in more than 3 troops, but you can get a really solid 3-troop assault/firepower support team out of this, usually starting with the Orc heavy machine gun. You might sometimes take the Feuerback. That can be a little bit of a meta pick. If there are lots and lots of tags in your local environment, you could give that some consideration. But when you have no visual mods, ballistic skill 14 is good, but when you have no visual mods, you're often thinking maximum burst to win those face-to-face rolls, and the heavy machine gun coming in at a very reasonably costed 34 points is an excellent start to an Orc troop fire team. Now, there are other pieces that you can take here, but usually it's going to be the heavy machine gun as the starting point. You then need a second thing that counts as an Orc to get you up to duo bonuses, and from that point onwards you're free. And there are 2 pieces or 2.5 pieces I would generally recommend as the piece that gets you up to duo bonuses in this link. The first, but probably less taken option, is either of the Orc options with boarding shotgun +1 burst. You can either have a boarding shotgun +1 burst or a boarding shotgun +1 burst and the tin bot. Given it's only 1 extra point, probably you take the tin bot most of the time, but I don't think there's a single piece in the entire game that brings a burst 3 boarding shotgun that I have found that is bad. If you get in range with that piece, you round a corner. That kind of close assault element often means you're going to be rounding a corner and catching an opponent out of cover. Now you have to deliver something to do that. You have to set that up in order to execute. But if you have that Orc troop come around a corner, it's going to be, if there's an Orc HMG still in the team, firing 3 dice and a special dice, armor piercing, power 6, hitting on 20s. And hitting on 20s with that many dice it's really good. It's just really good. You will often land 2 or 3 hits into an opponent because you can't miss with any of those attacks unless they have visual modifiers. And because you can't miss, you'll use the special die to discard one of the few dice that you have that they didn't manage to beat. And so it just really often lands 2 or 3 hits, and those hits are dangerous, again, because your opponent will usually be out of cover. The Orc boarding shotgun is a cheap and very effective assault element, the downside, of course, being that it is hackable, even with the tin bot. The reason why you will not always take that Orc boarding shotgun is that there is an alternative wild card that exists that counts as an Orc, and that is Valkyrie Elite Bodyguard. Now, she is a wild card, but she's a wild card that counts as an Orc, which means she'll usually be in an Orc fire team. You take the Orc HMG, you add Valkyrie, and for only 1 point more than the Tinbot Orc with boarding shotgun, you get this loadout. Now, there's a lot to take in there, and it is worth noting that if you are just looking for door kicking, the Orc with higher armor, a true extra wound, but more importantly 6-2 movement. 6-2 movement is really nice. If you're looking to come up to a corner and round that corner and shoot, the 2 extra inches of movement on the first short skill can make a big difference. However, in terms of raw power in close assault, Valkyrie has that in spades. One of the best pieces in the game, because she has a skill that previously would have called total immunity is now called immunity enhanced, and that is a rare skill these days, and it is as good as it has ever been, and she has no wound incapacitation. So she's immune to all kinds of ammunition. She can reliably tank a hit on the way into any kind of assault situation, and when she gets there, she will basically kill you. She has Berserk +3, Martial Arts level 3, CC 22. That means that against someone without martial arts, or actually even with martial arts of their own, because she also has Natural Born Warrior, that means she will always be rolling at least CC 28 with 1 die and 1 special die, which means that she will almost always or very, very often crit, and when she crits, she's critting with a power and strength 5 explosive CCW. Now, 28 points is not cheap. This is a good piece. You'll usually take the heavy shotgun because it is significantly cheaper. You'll basically always take the heavy shotgun. 28 points is cheap enough that you can't afford a piece like that to not do anything. And with just a heavy shotgun, you'll occasionally have situations where Valkyrie isn't always doing things in any given game. However, Valkyrie and an Orc and one other piece of your choosing is an extremely capable Haris team that gets duo bonuses, fights really, really well. You just want the third piece in that link, usually to be a specialist, and you have one of those wonderful little fire teams that can just do anything. And 3-person, reasonably mobile, reasonably dangerous fire teams that can do anything are an excellent addition to any list. Now, while we're talking about the Orc team, particularly that Haris configuration, you can add any wildcard into that link and have it do useful things. But we're going to talk about the other things that can only go in that link team, but consider, just as we consider walking through all the remainder of the pieces in White Company, talk about wildcards, just bear in mind that you could put in a Haidao, or you could put in Laxmee, or Emily Handelman, etc., and you'd still have a piece that you want in the link, and you're getting duo bonuses. However, one of the ways that you can have a nice specialist in that link team and get some other interesting things going as well is the Blade FTO Engineer. Now, we were all over Blades in N4, mostly because there were some really nice links that they could form in like Pan-Oceania with tags, and so you had a Tactical Awareness Engineer stapled to a Tactical Awareness tag. That day has kind of passed, and I think Blade Ops in the context of N5 and how everything else is costed are much more fair for their points cost. But especially if you're playing a scenario that has an engineer bonus, acquisition for example, you can do a lot worse than having a Blade Ops be the third person in that link team that I just mentioned. 23 points gets you a admittedly willpower 12 specialist, but it's also got Tactical Awareness, Mimetism, Passable Gunfighting. Effectively, it's 23 points for a Specialist and Tactical Awareness, but that's a really nice addition to a link team. The other things that I would consider adding to that link team would be something like, for example, Laxmee, who is a hacker, who has a picture she adds very nicely into that link team. But if you want to just stay within the bounds of the link, it's hard to go wrong with Tactical Awareness on your Specialist. Now, White Company is also not a faction that necessarily dislikes having an engineer. You can build a pretty solid remote kind of link. You can have, not link, list. You can have, particularly a Peacemaker is a good addition, usually just one, but a Peacemaker is a good addition to White Company. You can have Bulleteers. There are some decent tags that are available to the faction now. And so having an engineer as part of a mobile support element isn't bad, but it is willpower 12. Mostly what we're looking at here is, hey, it's my specialist in this link, and I need a specialist in this link. I may as well have tactical awareness and be able to gunfight at short range. Now, the other it's worth consideration in this link team is to actually forego the Orc HMG entirely, take an Orc boarding shotgun and probably Valkyrie. That is a team that is saying we're probably not going to have specialists here, but it does open up a Svalaheimer Nisse heavy machine gun, or multi-sniper rifle if that's your jam. Either way, what we have here is the thing that I just mentioned, which is the solid ballistic skill linked for good burst, MSV2, mimetism, smoke shooting piece. And given that you have access to ample high fizz smoke if you want it in White Company, this is, I would say, more of a tech piece because ultimately it is cost 10% of your available points, give or take, and it's very single wound. But if you want to do high value smoke shooting, the Svalaheimer Nisse is kind of in absolute terms winning gunfights, the best choice you have in the faction. There is one other piece we'll talk about in a little bit that is a very solid alternate consideration for smoke shooting, bit more of a compromise element. But just to consider if you want to do this fire team and you want to avail yourself of the ability, for example, to put enemy John Hawkwoods down like a dog unless they are taking the full 4 Fusiliers to support him. Svalaheimer Nisse is one of the ways you can do that in this faction. I will not, for example, be including one in the sample list we have at the end of this video, but they are something just to consider. Moving on down through our list of link teams that are pretty cool in White Company, we arrive at, finally, the Karhu special group. Now, Karhu were one of those pieces that were kind of definitive for White Company in N4. That's no longer the case. It's not because they're bad, it's just that White Company now has a much more diverse roster, and so can take a whole bunch of other things. Karhu are no longer essential to have good gunfighting. But they do. They do have good gunfighting, and you can take Karhu. And Karhu make, in particular, a really nice duo. If you've taken a Fusilier Core, an Orc Haris, well, we want another fire team. Sure, let's do that. Karhu as a duo, and a pure duo, no less, or even just singleton Karhu, but really the duo, if you can find the points for it, goes off pretty hard, is a fantastic addition. Firstly, they're an NCO. They are, in fact, the only, to my knowledge, NCO in the faction, and this is a faction that has maybe one solid active lieutenant kind of option, but who a lot of the time is going to have your lieutenant just be a Fusilier. Just a Fusilier hanging out in the rear with the gear, with that link team. And in that situation, having an NCO genuinely represents a free additional order, and Karhu are NCOs. Also, Karhu have, just as they did in N4, that Feuerback profile. Feuerback +1 burst, getting +1 special die from the link team, making them pseudo burst 4, with ballistic skill 13, MSV1, and mimetism. Climbing plus for mobility. Climbing plus is not what it was in N4, but it's still very good. And what we're basically getting there is a just about 4 die, Feuerback, ballistic skill 13, MSV1, mimetism. That is a piece that nothing in the game is willing to just write off. In active turn, that Karhu wins face-to-face rolls most of the time, and it does not need to win those face-to-face rolls by much to kill whatever it's shooting at. Now, to get the +1 special die, we need to have the Karhu be a pure duo, and the only way to have a pure duo of Karhus is to have a second Karhu. But happily, there are some really solid options. Any of those profiles with a multi-rifle will round out the range bands of the Feuerback. The Feuerback covers beyond 16, the multi-rifle covers up to 16, and it's still a perfectly dangerous weapon. And for my money, you're going to usually want a specialist, which means either the paramedic or the engineer. Now, there is probably the strongest first principles argument for the paramedic, because you're taking a Feuerback, you may as well link a paramedic with it, but frankly the Karhu fizz is low enough and their armor is only 2 and they're just single wound, that the chances, if the Karhu loses a face-to-face roll, there is not necessarily always going to be a body for you to recover, and that kind of actually leads me toward the engineer being a piece that you maybe want slightly more of the time, especially depending on the mission mix you are playing. If it is classified heavy, then just having access to decharges on a piece that's going to be moving its way up the field anyway makes that Karhu into an absolute classified machine. The paramedic is as well already to an extent, but just having those decharges, just kind of a nice thing to have. Now, White Company is a faction that does have kind of a luxury of decharges. If you want to have a bunch of decharges in your list, you actually can very, very easily. So hypothetically, for example, if you are going to a tournament that included Mind Wipe, but also had a very demanding mission lineup, some might say too demanding, you can at least rest easy in White Company, knowing it's pretty easy to include maybe 3 models with decharges into your list, in addition to a bunch of other anti-materiel, really just putting a scenario like Mind Wipe on lock with a faction like this. Karhu, they do hark back to the old age of White Company, but they are frankly easier than ever to get that critical firepower bonus from link teams to, and it's a really good choice to just take Feuerbach and Specialist Karhu as a very independent, effective, strong duo. Don't really wildcard anything into them, but it's one of the best duos you can access in the faction. Now, before we just jump on through the remaining wildcards, which I absolutely must mention, we'll mention the last notable fire team, which is the Varangian Guard duo. You can have two Varangian Guards. Varangian Guards are a solid and useful smoke platform. They are not quite Dadarazi, but they are by no means bad. They have Fizz 14, they have Smoke, they are better at winning close combat engagements against non-experts than they were in N4. I actually think Berserk +3 gives them a much better position as a bully, even if they can't be used as a trading piece, but they were never actually particularly good in N4 as a trading piece anyway, because AP CCWs tend to run out of steam. Like, you just can't, before you die making Berserk attacks, the AP CCW is not guaranteed to get through the target, whatever you were trying to fight. Now, it's just like, nope, I'm CC26, let's do this. Means that if the Varangian wants to take a close combat, they're actually pretty able to do so. In practice, however, what Varangian Guard are mostly going to be doing is throwing smoke, because smoke is very, very useful. They make a good corner guard. They're kind of annoying to get past. Fizz 14, Armor 2, and Dogged are their main attributes, combined with just some template weapons, but they can duo. And you will duo them occasionally. Getting them the special die on smoke in particular makes that smoke very reliable, but duoing them means not running them impetuous, and impetuous is a very nice and useful skill, same as has ever been, and having impetuous orders to throw the smoke for your things that might be wanting to smoke shoot, like Haidao, for example, which we'll talk about next, it's often almost going to be more worthwhile just to take the impetuous orders and split your two Varangian Guard out. However, if you do want to duo them, rather than duoing both of your Varangians together, you can duo one of them with Shona Carano, who in White Company and White Company only counts as a Varangian Guard. She can be taken in a Varangian duo in Starmada, but if you do that there, she doesn't count as a Varangian. In White Company, she does. I'm not entirely sure why that is. And Shona, kind of like Valkyrie, is one of those just high watermark pieces. Now, I think I said in a previous video that there was nothing I could think of that was more dangerous in absolute terms in close combat than her. There is one piece. I was corrected in the comments. Miyamoto Musashi. Miyamoto Musashi is marginally more dangerous than Shona Carano in close combat. He is the only thing in the game that is marginally more dangerous than Shona Carano, and he is the best thing in close combat in the game. Shona Carano loses a couple of points of close combat and a level of martial arts, but is otherwise the same, and basically the same as the best thing in the game, is still pretty high praise. She can be duoed with a Varangian, she can go into any other link team, she runs as a wild card, she just counts as a Varangian, and if you need to deliver absolute death to something at close combat range, she's one of the best pieces in the game to do it. She is marginally less durable than Valkyrie, which means that if you want to really use her as a door kicker into a fortified position, she might be more likely to be making a one-way trip, but just about anything that she goes into close combat with dies in one attack. She is very, very dangerous, and the only reason why you wouldn't take Shona all the time is, well, firstly, 22 points is still a little bit expensive, but secondly, there are just so many good close assault pieces, and you probably don't always need 4. But Shona, either as a wild card into any link team that's intended to go and do things in the midfield, or in particular as a member of a Varangian duo, or even just running free by herself because she is very fast and very dangerous, is an exceptionally solid piece. Now, rounding out the wild cards, we have a few things that we have to cover, and the first of them is the Haidao Special Support Group. The Haidao are one of the best wildcards in White Company, not just on their own merits, which are very good, but also because you can put up to 3 Haidao in any given link. And that means you can put 2 Haidao in any given link, which means you can get link bonuses from having 2 of the same trooper type in any given link. And that is particularly interesting, either in a Haris team or a core. An entirely valid Haris team, for example, is 1 Fusilier of your choice, and the Haidao Multi-Special Visor level 2, and the Hacker Killer Hacking Device Boarding Shotgun +1 Burst. That is a team that is not expensive, and gets +1 special die on its ballistic skill attacks, and has MSV2 smoke shooting if you want it, and has fantastic door kicking because there's that boarding shotgun +1 burst that I've been going on about, and it's got a ballistic skill 13 +1 special die pitcher with a killer hacker. And the Haidao are all heavy infantry. They are no wounding cap shock immune heavy infantry, but they're still heavy infantry. They have effectively a second wound, which means that you have resilience being bled into the faction, alongside things like Orcs and Valkyrie and Shona Carano, all this no wound incapacitation. We are starting to see that this is the single wound faction. This is why it's beginning to bleed out of White Company, and actually this is a faction that can have plenty of wounds, plenty of failure tolerance. Haidao are part of that. Now, I do genuinely think most of the time the two profiles here you will take are the MSV2 multi-sniper, and more often, most often, the 22-point killer hacker boarding shotgun +1 burst. That is a piece that combines fantastic door kicking and network projection, which is good because your other network projection can be a little bit expensive, particularly like midfield repeaters can be expensive, and a totally serviceable killer hacker. It is part of why White Company's hacking, while not in possession of those like real alpha pieces, right? White Company does not want to have to fight a hacking game against a fairy dusted Asura, but against anything short of that, it can compete ably without sacrificing strength elsewhere in the faction. And that's really cool. It has that great, like just enough good quality hacking, not necessarily on really, really cheap pieces, but on pieces that combine other strengths, like the Haidao being a great door kicker in addition to a great killer hacker. The Haidao KHD is just one of my favorite profiles in the game. It combines so many of the things that I like, and I recommend it very strongly. Even if you don't take the sniper rifle, you'd rather have that piece be doing some other things. So, excellent wildcard, one of the key strengths of White Company. Next up, we have Laxmee. I think that's how it's pronounced, but happy to be corrected. Hacker of Fortune. This is one of those character profiles that came in from other sectorals alongside Valkyrie, for example, and she's a really solid one and another one of those examples of how they could kind of just push character profiles in N5, because I don't actually think Laxmee is overpowered, but I think she's good and interesting, and they can afford to make good and interesting character profiles because there's only ever going to be one of her. And what we get in Laxmee is she's not a door kicker, right? She's not going to round the corner with that mimetism -3 ballistic skill 11 submachine gun and absolutely do work, but she is a wild card. And she has a pitcher, and linked pitchers of almost any ballistic skill are good. Ballistic skill 11 is not high, but if you're linking her into like a little Fusilier team, for example, it's still +1 special die, and that's enough. And she's a mine layer with cyber mines. Cyber mines are not a joke in N5, so that's nice as well, bit of deployment zone coverage. And she has a hacking device plus, which gives us access to white noise, which is very nice, for example, in addition to John Hawkwood, if you need to do some white noise smoke shooting. And then just on top of all of that, she has upgrade Fairy Dust. Now, Fairy Dust is one of those programs that you don't take an Evo hacker just for Fairy Dust unless you are specifically playing an Asura or an Anathematic, for example. But if you do have it, then being able to spend an order and put it up at kind of no opportunity cost, not having to put the entire Evo hacker into your list, for example, is really nice. There are just times when that's good. And when it's not time for that to be good, you don't spend the order on it. And she does all of the other hacking things where she is a BTS 6 Willpower 14 Hacking Device Plus with a pitcher and Mind Layer for 24 points. Now, she's a sometimes piece. There are other options. You don't always want to be going all in on hacking, but if you have a list that has a Haidao and Laxmee and maybe a Danavas, that's a ton of hacking, like hacking capability, for just 2 or 3 models. And that's just sound and good, which pretty much exemplifies Laxmee. She's a really nice piece to have access to. Now, this is by no means the end of the wildcard list. There are actually a really long list of wildcards in White Company. For example, I'm going to gloss over Senior Masakari, even though he's really cool and interesting. But we are going to use Liang Kai as kind of a bridging piece, because Liang Kai is a wildcard in White Company. Probably don't wildcard Liang Kai in White Company particularly often. Like, it's not bad to do, but Liang Kai, just as he was in N4, is one of the game's absolutely premier missiles. He doesn't add to fire team composition in any of the White Company fire teams. He doesn't count as anything. So if you are adding to him to a fire team, it is just so you can kind of drag him along for an order or two before you run him into the midfield. Maybe you're running like Hawkwood and a Fusilier and you want nothing else in that team. Well, Liang Kai will let you form it up as a Harry's team. and then he can Impetuous free on the first order of the game. And the Impetuous is kind of the big thing here, because Impetuous and Super Jump, Super Jump is no longer nearly as bad in Link teams as it used to be. The rules in no way whatsoever support Link teams working nicely with Super Jump and non-Super Jump profiles, except that there's a thing somewhere that says that when the fire team leader declares Super Jump, anyone without Super Jump just declares regular jump, which actually isn't slowing things down too much because that's a 6-inch movement in N5. So you can have Liang Kai or Shona super jumping around in a Link team without completely leaving behind whatever it was that they were linked to. But in practice, Liang Kai is actually, even though he's a wild card, he's really our segue into independent operators in White Company. He wants to be using that effective 6-6 move with super jump, the forward deployment, the stealth, the incredible close combat, etc., to move forward, find a target, and eliminate it. And because he is actually one of the cheapest, like if you compare him to, he's cheaper than Shona, but he's cheaper than Shona. He's cheaper than Valkyrie. He's not cheaper than Carmen Johns, but he's more maneuverable, not more mobile, but more maneuverable than she is. If you need to just solve one specific problem, like for example a Masai Moran, he's a fantastic example of a piece that can do that. He is not necessarily something that should be included in every single list, but you could kind of include him in every single list if you wanted to. He just goes and solves problems. He will usually solve one problem per game, although there will be games where that one problem is everything on an opponent's flank. Now, in terms of other solo operators that aren't like midfield pieces, which we'll talk about next, we will mention the Danavas hacker. Now, it should be noted that the Danavas is not linkable in any capacity in White Company, which means that Ballistic Skill 11 pitcher is operating entirely under its own power. It has one 55% die chance to hit per shot, which is not remotely reliable, but it is otherwise a quite good, quite cheap hacker. It's willpower 15, it's only BTS 3, but it's willpower 15, and it's a hacking device plus with Oblivion plus 1 burst. Mostly because of the link ability, I think I would usually be reaching for Laxmee before I was reaching for a Danavas, but if you needed to cut 2 points or didn't have a spot to link Laxmee, the Danavas is 2 points cheaper and it is 1 point willpower higher. Especially if you're just looking for the ability to use white noise, for example, the Danavas is higher willpower, it's going to be doing it slightly more often. It is kind of in absolute terms more likely to succeed its actual hacking rolls, but for only 2 points more, the fact that Laxmee has Mind Layer and is a wild card, I think probably sees her used in a little more, like a larger variety of lists, but the Danavas as a single solo operator, perhaps a hacker in Combat Group 2, or a hacker in whichever combat group doesn't contain your other non-killer hackers, very serviceable addition. Now, last in the list of independent operator style pieces, we have Carmen John's Mercenary Biker. Now, a couple of the factions that Carmen Johns is accessible in, she kind of has to carry the role of rapid offensive unit entirely by herself. In White Company, she is happily relieved of that as the sole burden, and you can instead use her much more opportunistically. She's fast, she's dangerous, she has random high roll potential thanks to Booty, she is dogged herself and brings along Bâtard, who has just a suite of useful things that he's adding to the faction, including Sensor, for example. He's dogged himself and he has that trench hammer. You can use these two pieces defensively just because of the fact that they are dogged. You can use them offensively, you can use them for utility. Carmen's close combat is just kind of okay. CC attack -6 is a very nice skill, but she has no martial arts, which means that to really maximize her close combat potential to actually be a bully, she kind of has to move into close combat alongside Bâtard and either just present the fork or just win face-to-face rolls there off the back of the burst bonuses from having multiple models in close combat. But even if she never sees close combat, just doing like corner movements and threatening the fork of the heavy pistol plus 1 AP heavy pistol plus 1 burst, chain rifle, and Bâtard's trench hammer makes her a very applicable piece for 17 points. Now, technically speaking, there are other biker pieces in the game that are cheaper and at least as good as Carmen Johns. They're not many. There's one biker piece that's cheaper and just as good as Carmen Johns, but 17 points is still not particularly expensive, and because she brings the two different models, her and Bâtard, you have this wide applicability. Again, a bit like with Liang Kai, not necessarily a piece that you should include in every single list, just because eventually you will run out of both points and troops, and she is competing, right? Like if you're going to take Liang Kai and Shona Carano and Valkyrie, you probably aren't also taking Carmen Johns, but you should usually take maybe two at least, of these high quality close assault pieces, and she is absolutely a high quality close assault piece. Now, moving on from deployment zone-ish bound independent operator elements to midfield pieces, there are a couple of notable midfield elements that are available to White Company, but this is where we start to see some of the limitations of the faction. Not bad, because a Peacemaker is very good, but it's where the faction's strength begins to become more limited, and where the choices that you take narrow down a little bit. Peacemakers, however, are really good. I particularly like, and I think most people at this stage have kind of landed on particularly liking, provided you have the SWC, the half an SWC 24-point profile. It has a heavy shotgun with mimetism, and an Oxbot with a heavy flamethrower, and a pulsar, and the Oxbot has mine layer, which means you get an Oxbot and a Peacemaker, which is a midfield repeater, and the mine, all for the price of one troop slot and 24 points. And it's just a very versatile element. It's dangerous, genuinely dangerous on the attack, it's powerful on the defense, it provides multiple defensive capabilities because it has multiple templates and the mine and the repeater. You really can't ask for much more for 24 points as a midfield element. Now, the big limitation of Peacemakers is the same as it has always been, which is that they are Silhouette 4, and you are just not guaranteed to have, particularly with, they don't have infiltration, they just have 4 deployment plus 8, you are not guaranteed to have 2 places to deploy 2 Peacemakers with their Oxbots. You will run out of space eventually, because especially with just 4 deployment 8, you're not always going to have cool spaces to put these kind of pieces, which limits especially the second Peacemaker, kind of diminishing returns. However, as far as reserve drops go, they're outstanding. As far as defensive pieces go, they're very good. And as far as clutch offensive pieces go, I have absolutely had games broken open by Peacemakers, and N5 is no different. Very, very nice piece, but 24 points is not nothing, and we are starting to get into the things are getting a little bit pricey. There is no way to take, for example, all of the things that I've mentioned in this video so far. However, Peacemakers are very nice, and if you're looking for that ablative kind of defense to combine with something like Hawkwood as an ARO piece, they're an excellent addition to a list. Now, slightly more niche, yes, even in N5, are Guilang skirmishers. If you would like to hear my opinion on Guilang skirmishers, go back to the previous video I did on White Company, because my opinion has not significantly changed. Now, pretty much across the board, Guilangs are 2 points cheaper than they were in N4. I think the multi-sniper might actually be even more. It might be something like 4 points cheaper. However, Guilangs are still ballistic skill 11, which means that if we are using them, we are probably ideally not using them for gunfighting, but we're sure paying for that multispectral visor. And so, for example, if I look at that hacking device Guilang, it's a camouflage hacker. Cool. It's 31 points. Do you know what kind of quality hackers I can get for much less than 31 points in this faction? They won't be under a marker state, they won't be infiltrating, but they will be in absolute terms like better, stronger, more dangerous additions to a list much of the time. The Guilang mine layer, like 25 points is more attractive than it was at 27, absolutely. But it is still a piece that boarding shotguns without the templates, this is a piece that is particularly like the Guilang is suffering from the fact that boarding shotguns now no longer have templates because it's having to rely on its ballistic skill 11. Yeah, okay, sure, it's hitting on 17s if it rounds a corner and has something out of cover, but it's just burst 2. Right? This is not a piece that is the same as a linked Haidao or a linked Orc in terms of its door kicking ability, and it is 27 or 25 points rather. And while for 25 points you get the ability to mine lay either a deployable repeater or a shock mine, it is more expensive than a Peacemaker. Now, I did just say that the Peacemaker, particularly diminishing returns, right? Having the second Peacemaker is going to be challenging compared to a Guilang, which will be much easier to deploy, but that's literally the use case. The use case of the Guilang is that it is easier to deploy than a second Peacemaker. However, in that context, it absolutely is, and I am sure there will be people who are playing White Company who are Guilang enjoyers, and, well, they're all 2 points cheaper now. And hey, there's even a generic profile that has 2 regular pistols. Doesn't do anything, it's just a typo, but you can have a pistol Guilang if you are so inclined for 23 points. It won't do anything, but it is 23 points compared to 25 as it was in N4. Now, continuing our quite limited midfield presence in White Company, we should mention the Beast Hunters Free Guild. I kind of like Beast Hunters even less than I did in N4, and 15 points for an irregular piece is actually a surprisingly hard spend when we consider how many other things there are in this faction that we really want to pay for before we pay for a Beast Hunter. But if you are hurting for midfield elements, then the super jump change has been good to Beast Hunters. It's just that they really struggle to actually do anything dangerous. They have a single heavy flamethrower and a single CC21 DACW. They're not actually just terribly dangerous to anything that they might contact. But Super Jump is at least very mobile, and if you need to suicide a piece into, say, an enemy like Link team, they do have the option of doing something there. I actually think probably the more relevant use case for Beast Hunters is in the Link teams that they can join. And in particular, that Karhu fire team that I mentioned before, if you wanted to run that as a Haris, it can include a Beast Hunter FTO. And you actually probably don't ever necessarily activate that Beast Hunter. What you can do with that Link team is move the Karhu out to, like, you just have the Beast Hunter as an ARO piece. It's 9 points, it has +1 special die, Panzerfaust, Ballistic Skill 11, and Mimetism. If it dies, but it's got that disposable Panzerfaust. They can fire 2 shots off because special die doesn't consume disposable ammunition, and it's only 9 points. And that is an ARO that even a tag doesn't necessarily want to mess with. And so you can basically take the 9.1 as a random cheap ARO piece early in the game, and then you can just leave it behind. I mean, you might not. You could move it along with the Kaplan, but the point is it's just an ARO piece for early in the game, and you can use the Karhu, sorry, you could also link with Kaplans. You use the Karhu, you move out, and then you consider moving the Karhu back even. And at that point, the Beast Hunter can just rejoin the Link team in the States phase and resume the business that he was doing previous in the game. And so this is like 9 points is not a bad buy for a piece like this, but it's not something that I'm reaching out for. It's in these midfield pieces like Guilangs and Beast Hunters that we start to see where the faction has limits, and probably just as well, because the faction better have some limits because the character squadrons that you can build are just so useful and interesting. Now, just to go through a few more profiles, because this video is getting long enough, tags in White Company bear mentioning. Now, in N4, the only tag that you had access to in White Company was the Güijia, which you could run. It was okay. And in N5, it's still okay. It's fine, in fact. Super Jump is a nice skill for slightly different reasons to what it was in N4, but it's a nice skill to have. On top of that, the Güijia is basically your only interesting active lieutenant piece, but it is an interesting active lieutenant piece, and there is some serviceable chain of command in the faction, the Haidao in particular, if you want to be able to go ham with a Güijia squadron lieutenant and still have some insurance against loss of lieutenant. It is not the kind of thing I would build into every list, but there are some games and scenarios and situations where that could be really fun to experiment with. Slightly more interesting, or at least representing an expansion of the roster, is the presence of Scarface and Cordelia in White Company. Now, in absolute terms, Scarface is not more dangerous than a Güijia. A Güijia is better than Scarface. But Scarface is almost 20 points cheaper and brings much of the same capability. In a lot of respects, Scarface is really just a discount Güijia. He has some close combat skills and an AP heavy machine gun much of the time. You can actually take the AP Spitfire +1 burst if you're running something like Hawkwood and have longer range firepower taken care of elsewhere. Burst 5 is quite nice, but either of those two profiles at 58 points is almost 20 points cheaper than the Güijia. And you get most of the same capability, which is why Scarface is just a solid piece in basically any of the factions that he's in. Now, inasmuch as he has a downside, it's that he gets Cordelia Turner stapled to him, although they can't duo in this list. There is technically an armored fire team that you can access in White Company, but it's comprised of anacondas, so we aren't going to talk about that much particularly more. But Cordelia Turner, if we think about Scarface as a very cheap tag, Cordelia is just the price of doing business with Scarface. She's not fantastic. It's not that she's actually bad, it's just that 18 points is more than we necessarily want to pay for an engineer that can't link with anything, so she's kind of got to find a reason for existing alongside Scarface, but hey, even if we add both of them together, they're still cheaper than a Güijia, and we get a whole second troop who is a specialist and has mimetism and has a gizmo kit, those are useful, etc. She's got a boarding pistol, which means she has a template weapon, she has paramines, she's not likely to have many orders spent on her, but she's basically free alongside Scarface for less than the price of a Güijia. And so between the two of them, White Company has graduated from possibly the most limited tag access outside of US Ariadne, for example, in the game, to, yeah, like solid mercenary company levels of tag access. If you want to do tag stuff in White Company, you can now. It's not high watermark, it's not the best in the game, but it's not the worst either, and it's something that the faction can do that it couldn't do before. And especially if you're looking at being into a faction for the long haul, or having multiple viable lists that you can either have to force your opponent to think about at list construction, or just have access to in an event, that's a nice thing to have. Now, just to round this list of troops out with some things I haven't talked about yet, but probably should, we'll mention just briefly a few other interesting things. And the first of those is the Bulleteer armbots. They're quite good. They don't have the same potential in White Company that they necessarily do in other factions, because you're not necessarily dying to run out and take an Evo hacker as part of like some turret reload strategy or anything like that, but it's still a Mimetism 6 Spitfire, and you have, as I mentioned, pretty ample access to engineers, whether you're taking a Karhu, or a Blade Ops, or a Haidao, or even Scarface and Cordelia, because you have kind of nice incidental access to engineers in White Company, having a remote that you can repair that has remote presence is a nice thing to instantly have access to. And so the Bulleteer just rounds that out. 22 points for the Spitfire is the profile that you usually will want to take. And it's a Mimetism 6 Spitfire. Solid profile to consider, although not for taking in too many lists. Next up, we should mention Tiger Soldiers, just because they are the sole model with combat jump in the faction. Now, I am historically not a Tiger Soldier connoisseur, but it's kind of hard to argue with these profiles in N5. The jet propulsion on every model with combat jump is something that they really benefit from, and they are a ballistic skill 13 mimetism piece still. 20 points for the cheapest, and then 26 to 29 points for the remainder of the profiles is suspiciously affordable. Now, in White Company, they're not going to be easy to take terribly often because we have lots of pieces that are competing for that 20 to 30 point slot, but none of these profiles are bad on their own merits. Their biggest downside is definitely that they are only Phys 12, which really does not give them a particularly high chance of sticking the landing without some kind of external support, and once you start taking that external support, you really telegraph their presence. But as far as being a combat jump trooper with good gunfighting goes, they're just one of the best. Finally, and the genuine wild card of I have no idea if these are good or not. I generally have a hard time reading Kunai Solutions ninjas, is the Kunai Solutions ninja. These things have been introduced in N4 and then buffed in N5, and there's a chance they're okay now. Long-range gunfighting ninjas, basically. Now, they have no forward deployment. They deploy with hidden deployment and Mimetism 6 and camouflage in your deployment zone, but they have the guns to make use of that, whether it's the multi-sniper or the Thunderbolt or the Shock AP marksman rifle. They have just enough close combat to be able to potentially fight their way out of wet paper bag, although with a PS6 Shock CCW as their only weapon, they aren't doing that much damage if they do connect. The main reason you might consider taking these is actually as long-range surprise fire support, and without playing them, which I haven't, I have no idea if they're good or not. But taking one does fake out a Tiger Soldier, and faking out a Tiger Soldier when you actually have no intention of hitting the backside of your opponent's deployment zone can cause some interesting deployment conundrums for your opponent that can pay off in other ways. And so, even if the Kunai Solutions Ninja is literally there because you have a Tiger Soldier model and you just put it on your tray and you're like, oh yeah, no, we're good. Yeah, I've only deployed 14 troops. Yeah, no, I just did 14 trooper list. Having that fake out potential, having that one other piece that might conceivably be taken, is at least an interesting option. I cannot actually recommend them because I haven't played them and I have no idea if Ballistic Skill 12 Burst 2 or 3 is enough to go the distance. Like that Thunderbolt profile in particular looks like it's right on the cusp of potentially having some potential. T2 is an interesting ammunition type, but Thunderbolts are just damage 6. You won't always connect with them. Like, if you connect with them, you won't always injure. They're just too hard to read. But someone should go out there and play Kunai Solutions Ninja and report back and tell me if they're any good. And so, to round out this particular faction focus, we have a sample list. As always, this comes with the caveat that this is by no means the only way to play the faction, but it is a list that shows off many of the strengths that I have just discussed. Although, White Company being as broad as it is, by no means all. I haven't captured everything that I'd like to, but I have got 3 fire teams and a bunch of other stuff going on, so let's kind of talk through it. The first thing we have is actually 2 flexible fire teams. It's worth noting that the Haidao and Laxmee are both wildcards that don't necessarily add anything to how the fire team is going to perform. They don't add to composition bonuses, and so depending on what you think these 2 teams are going to be doing, you could swap those around. In this configuration, I've kind of intimated that the first fire team will be Hawkwood, a Haidao KHD, boarding shotgun, and 2 Fusiliers, with the intention that Hawkwood leaves behind one of those Fusiliers at some point and moves 3 models kind of into the midfield where the Haidao can do some door kicking. Now, you could reconfigure this if you thought, look, Hawkwood's never going to move for the entire game. He's in a position where I want him to be the entire game. Therefore, I don't need door kicking on this link team. You could swap Laxmee into the link team and have her a little bit less exposed to danger, and have the Haidao be part of a more aggressive team moving into the midfield, led by the Orc with a wildcard hacker and Valkyrie. So we have a 4-person core and a 3-person Haris team. Now, I did mention before, and I think as a meta read, you might consider changing this at some point in future. If smoke shooting becomes very common, consider adding in more Fusiliers, having that configuration: Fusilier hacker, Fusilier forward observer, Fusilier lieutenant, Fusilier. Just because that version of the link is immune to smoke shooting, Hawkwood can fire back without the -6 penalty, but this is for more general use. I want Hawkwood's team, if he needs to be able to roll up its sleeves, go into the midfield, and get its hands dirty. So we've then got Orc, Laxmee, Valkyrie, Carmen and Bâtard and a Varangian, putting this at a 9-trooper combat group. You could adjust these if needed, but there are enough interesting active elements in Group 2 that I kind of wanted the option for the 9-6 split. Your mileage may vary, adjust as you would like. In Combat Group 2, then, we have a Karhu. Oh, to note, the Varangian are not linked because I want good sources of smoke in both combat groups, but you could, if you wanted to link the Varangians and go to 4 fire teams, just swap like a Warcore or something with that Varangian in Group 1. In Combat Group 2, we then have the Karhu duo that I mentioned, Karhu Feuerback and Karhu Engineer. We have a Peacemaker, just the one, 24 points. This is the Mine Layer Peacemaker profile, a Varangian, a Fugazi, and a Warcore. The Fugazi is a cheap order. It gives us just 1 repeater in the deployment zone. Usually it'll be hanging out wherever Laxmee isn't, just to give you that little bit of coverage against hackable elements pushing their way into your DZ. And then a Warcore is a very cheap order, because I took a lot of quite luxury pieces in this link, but let's not forget that in the current ITS season, Warcores are specialists, and 3 points for a specialist, irregular, spends its regular order, moves forward, and at some point during the game presses a button. Pretty hard to argue with that. Now, this list is missing a few pieces that otherwise be really nice to have. It doesn't have Shona Carano. It doesn't have Liang Kai. In fact, it has no super jump pieces whatsoever. But to add those in would involve making some significant compromises elsewhere. It would mean doing something like cutting the Orc fire team, for example. We could cut the Orc and Valkyrie for 2 Haidao, right? Haidao Killer Hacker, Haidao Sniper, and a Fusilier. That gives us a cheaper, still good gunfighting team that can move into the midfield and still close assault, etc. That would potentially free up some points. We could cut the Karhu down to just a singleton Karhu, not in a duo. We could remove the Peacemaker if we were playing in an exclusion zone scenario. There are a bunch of changes that you could make here that would enable you to include things like Shona, things like Liang Kai, things like a Blade Operator if you wanted that in place of the Laxmee in the Orc Fire team. Lots of different tinkering options, even before we get to total rebuilds, to do things like include the full 5-person Fusilier link, or even start playing with tags. But this will give you an idea of how White Company can be built in N5, and just looking at it, if we compare it to all the way back to our conversation earlier about how in N4 White Company tended to be the single wound faction, in this we have Hawkwood, who is effectively 2 wounds, Haidao, who is effectively 2 wounds, Orc, who is effectively 2 wounds, or is actually 2 wounds, the Valkyrie, who is effectively 2 wounds, Carmen, who is 1 wound with Dogged, and Bâtard, who is 1 wound with Dogged, who brings an extra trooper effectively, the Peacemaker, who brings its extra piece, and we have in total, this is not like Toha or Invincible Army level of ablative wounds, additional like failure tolerance that you can build into a list, but it's not bad either. And so this list kind of showcases that White Company really have expanded beyond the constraints that they were under in N4 and are a really solid, well-rounded, dangerous, lots of different options, lots of different firepower pieces, hacking, close assault, everything that you might want in a faction in some capacity is going on in White Company, and as far as factions to deep dive into early in N5, there are not a lot of better choices to choose from. As always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this faction focus. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description or by becoming a channel supporter on YouTube. Channel supporters and donors allow me to continue to do this, release weekly or just about weekly videos. And when I am considering things I'd like to do videos on, I always consult first with requests from channel supporters, like for example, channel supporter Mike K, who noted in a donation that he would like my take on White Company. Mike, I hope you've enjoyed this faction focus. And to everyone, as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.